Ever wondered how our modern global economy really got built? We often picture empires being forged with armies and flags, but between 1750 and 1900, a whole different kind of power started taking over. One that conquered nations not with soldiers, but with something way more subtle: money. This is the story of economic imperialism. Let's dive in. So that's the big question, right? How do you control an entire nation without a single soldier on its soil? It's a heck of a puzzle. And the answer, it turns out, is a different kind of warfare. Because if you can control a country's trade, its resources, and its debt, well, you can control the country itself. And sometimes you can control it even more completely than any occupying army ever could. And that gets us to our key idea for today: economic imperialism. Basically, it's a strategy where a powerful, industrialized nation uses its economic muscle, its banks, its big companies, its control over the market, to influence and ultimately dominate a less developed nation. It's empire building, just with balance sheets instead of battleships. Okay, to really see how this all played out in the real world, our first stop is China. For centuries, China was an absolute economic giant. But by the 1800s, it had a huge weakness. It hadn't industrialized the way Britain had. And that gap between an ancient power and a modern one, created the perfect storm for exploitation. You can really see the problem Britain was facing right here. The British public was absolutely obsessed with Chinese goods. We're talking tea, silk, porcelain, you name it. But China, it was pretty self-sufficient and had almost zero interest in anything Britain was selling. The result was this incredibly lopsided trade. It was a total financial nightmare for Britain, with a massive river of silver just flowing straight out of the country and into China. Britain desperately needed to turn this around, and their solution was, well, it was as cold-blooded as it was effective. The plan was ruthless and simple: grow tons and tons of opium in British India, smuggle it into China, and create a market by getting a huge portion of the population addicted. From a purely economic view, it worked like a charm. The new, massive demand for opium didn't just plug the hole in their finances, it completely reversed the flow, pulling China's wealth right back into British hands. Of course, the Chinese government didn't just sit back and watch this happen. They fought back against the state-sponsored drug trade, banning opium and destroying massive shipments of it. Britain's response? War. Their modern industrial military absolutely crushed China's traditional forces, which led to something called the Treaty of Nanjing. But listen, this wasn't a negotiation. It was basically a document of economic surrender. It forced China to open its ports and give Britain all sorts of special privileges. And just a few years later, a second war led to even more of these so-called unequal treaties. Deals where one side holds all the cards and writes all the rules. And this was the result. This wasn't about planting a flag and taking over directly. Instead, China was essentially carved up into these spheres of influence. Think of it like this. Different European powers basically claimed exclusive economic dibs on entire regions. So in its sphere, Britain or France or Germany made the rules for all the trade and investment. China was still technically an independent country, but in reality, its ability to control its own economy had been completely shattered. All right, so now let's hop across the globe to a different part of the world, where the same goal was achieved with a totally different tool. In Latin America, economic imperialism was often less about brute force and more about finance. And our case study here is Argentina, where the weapon of choice wasn't the gunboat, it was investment capital. Just take a second to really look at that number. Over 200 million pounds. In today's money, that's billions and billions. British banks and investors just flooded Argentina with cash. But this wasn't aid, not by a long shot. It was a very strategic, very calculated investment designed to do one thing: totally remake Argentina's economy to serve British industry. And you can see exactly where that money went. British capital built Argentina's entire infrastructure, its railways, its ports, but look at how it's designed. Every single railway line acts like a funnel, channeling resources from the heartland directly to the coast, ready for export. Almost nothing was built to connect Argentina's cities to each other or to build up a local market. The whole system was engineered for one purpose: to suck raw materials like wool, beef, and grain out of Argentina and feed them to British factories. Argentina's economy was now basically hardwired into Britain's, creating this deep, lasting dependency. So, these two examples, China and Argentina, they show us a global pattern. The engine driving this entire system was the non-stop demand for raw materials. The factories in Europe and North America had a bottomless appetite, and economic imperialism was the method they used to feed it. This table gives you a fantastic snapshot of just how big this was. You've got cotton from India and Egypt feeding British textile mills, which in turn forced those places into becoming these vulnerable single-crop economies. Then there's palm oil from sub-Saharan Africa, which was crucial for industrial lubricants and soap. Getting it meant completely reorganizing local societies, land, and labor. And look at copper from Chile. Foreign companies owned the mines and took the profits, leaving very little actual wealth for the country itself. Now, all of this might feel like it's just dusty old history, but it's really not. The economic relationships that were forged back then, all those patterns of trade, of investment, of dependency, they didn't just disappear. They cast a very long shadow that stretches all the way to today. These historical relationships cast long shadows. That really just nails it, doesn't it? The basic power imbalance between industrialized nations and the countries that produce raw materials. The very structure of who owns what and who owes what in the global economy, so much of that architecture was built during this period. We are, in many ways, still living inside the house that was built back then. Which really leaves us with a final question to chew on. When you look at the world today, when you see international development loans, super complex trade deals, or the incredible power of multinational corporations, how much has really changed? Where can you see the echoes of these old power plays in our modern global economy? It's definitely something worth thinking about. Thanks for joining me.